just lift my hand up here for transitioning slides, since I know I have a number of them for animation purposes. So I'm going to be presenting some data also in a young adult sample recruited separately from the DEAR study, looking at both perceived and desired social support in relation to suicidal ideation. Next slide.
Yeah, sorry, Sarah.
Oh, that's okay. So as both of our previous presenters have discussed, major suicide theories have long highlighted the importance of connection. Both the interpersonal psychological theory as well as the three steps theory have talked a lot about how connection serves as a buffer against serious suicidal ideation. Next slide. However, most research to date has focused on the absence of connection, so things like thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness as potential risk factors for suicidal ideation, and or has examined acute interpersonal stressors such as rejection or criticism as triggers for suicidal crises. There's been relatively less focus on some of the protective effects of social support, whether perceived or actual. Next slide. There's been some more recent research using daily diary methods to examine perceived social support and suicidal ideation on a day-to-day level. However, these data have been somewhat limited based off of the timeframes being assessed. Next slide. Specifically, some of the questions that remain to be answered are how short-term changes within a single day with respect to perceived social connection or desired social connection might lead or contribute to proximal changes in suicidal ideation. There's also been relatively little research on support-seeking behaviors, so attempts to actually reach out and get support, or what we conceptualize as desired support. And as Dr. Scott was speaking about, it may be that this incongruence between what someone desires and what someone actually perceives could potentially be more critical relative to what their actual perceptions are. Next slide. So for this project, we were interested in examining a few different aspects of this question. So the most critical being a way to examine both perceived social support and support-seeking behaviors in the same model, in the same sample, over the same time periods, and looking at those things in relation to suicidal ideation in a young adult sample, which we know is a high-risk period for suicidal thoughts. Next slide. So the first question was examining whether suicidal ideation would co-vary with perceived social support when assessed over a short time interval using ecological momentary assessment data collection practices. So if we ask someone, how suicidal have you felt in the last few minutes, and how much perceived support do you experience in the last few minutes, how those things might be related, controlling for negative affect, which we know is of course strongly related to suicidal thoughts and to perceptions of social support. Next slide. And the second question was how support-seeking behavior would relate to subsequently reported suicidal ideation, especially in the context of same-time perceptions of social support. Next slide. So these data were drawn from a larger study examining short-term predictors of self-injurious thoughts and behaviors broadly, including both suicidal and non-suicidal behaviors and thoughts in young adults. Next slide. Participants completed a baseline session which involved interviews to assess history of SITB, including the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale and components from the Self-Injurious Thoughts and Behaviors interview, as well as a battery of questionnaires. The data that we'll most be focusing on today are from a 2-week ecological momentary assessment, or EMA protocol. Next slide. Participants were recruited on the basis of past month non-suicidal self-injury urges or behaviors related to broader study aims. Although the sample was young adults, these were not specifically a college sample. They were recruited online entirely after the pandemic started. Anyone in the United States between the ages of 18 and 34 who met our eligibility criteria and who was able to participate virtually were eligible. Participants were paid for their participation. Data collection is ongoing. We hope to wrap up in the next few weeks. The current analytic sample is 69 individuals who completed the baseline and had completed all 14 days of their EMA data collection at the time that these data were analyzed about a week ago. Although participants were recruited on the basis of past month NSSI urges or behaviors, we had a very high prevalence of suicidal thoughts and behaviors as well. 96% of the sample reported lifetime SI, and over half of the sample reported SI in the month prior to participation. And so EMA reported rates of suicidal ideation were quite high as well. Next slide. The mean age of the sample was just over 23. We had participants 18 to 33 years of age. Next slide. In terms of gender, we had a somewhat interesting distribution. About half were cisgender women, and over a quarter identified as gender nonconforming, trans, non-binary, or gender queer, which may be an artifact of the fact that we have other studies in our lab going on related to gender identity, or maybe because we simply have more of these options available on our demographics form than some other studies include. And we did have about 17% cisgender men. Next slide. In terms of race ethnicity, a little under 2/3 were non-Hispanic white, about 20% Hispanic or Latinx, and then a somewhat smaller proportion in other racial or ethnic groups. Next slide. In terms of the EMA data, participants completed one of two EMA protocols that used different notification strategies. So in one strategy, we used what's called signal contingent notification, where participants gave us their own wake and bedtimes and were sent 6 pseudo-random notifications to complete surveys between those intervals. Each survey stayed open for 30 minutes, and they received a reminder after 10 minutes if they hadn't clicked the link. The other version of the protocol is what's referred to as event contingent surveys, in which participants received a reminder each morning after their wake time that alerted them to complete a survey anytime they had a self-injurious thought or behavior. So for those types of protocols, compliance is a little bit trickier to estimate, since of course the number completed is going to vary on the basis of the person's individual experience. Next slide. So as part of our larger study aims, we were examining differences between event and signal contingent protocols. So about half of the sample did 1 week of only event contingent protocols and 1 week of signal contingent. The other half did 2 weeks of entirely signal contingent protocols. Next slide. So as you can see, the completed number of surveys is quite different. This is in part because the number of surveys that they were quote unquote expected to do during the signal contingent week differs depending on whether they had 1 or 2 weeks there. Next slide. Importantly, the reported rates of suicidal ideation, perceived social support, and support seeking were virtually identical whether participants were enrolled in protocol version 1 or 2. And because we were only examining reports at the same time point rather than, as Dr. Brown and Dr. Scott mentioned, controlling for lagged analyses, we chose to collapse those data for these analyses today. Next slide. So participants rated at the time of the survey their current levels of suicidal ideation. Sorry, I just noticed that there was a question in the chat about whether it was a convenient sample. No, these were actually not participants drawn from a prior study. When I mentioned that we have ongoing studies related to gender diversity, those have separate recruitment criteria. The only thought about why they might be overlapping is that potentially people see advertisements for multiple studies and therefore are more likely to be interested in others, but they were not recruited across studies. So at the time of the EMA survey, participants rated their level of suicidal thoughts on 2 different items, how much perceived emotional social support they had on 2 items, and then 8 items tapping different components of negative affect like sadness, anger, fear. Next slide. They were also asked to report on experiences since the last survey they completed, however long ago that was, and they completed 1 item identifying whether or not they had reached out to anybody for emotional or social support. Next slide. These analyses were conducted using Bayesian estimation and M+ with a 2-level fixed effects model. Next slide. That allows for centering both at the within and between person level. So when I talk about increases in suicidal ideation at the within person level, that refers to relative to a person's own mean level across the entire EMA. At the between person level, that means individuals with higher SI on average compared to the overall sample. Next slide. Because we had multiple items capturing current SI, negative affect, and current perceived social support, those were all treated as latent variables at the within and between person level. The support-seeking behavior was an observed variable, as there was only one item tapping that. Next slide. This is a visual representation of the model examined. So what you can see is that we have 4 variables of interest: suicidal ideation, negative affect, support-seeking behavior, and perceived support. And all of those variables were allowed to co-vary within the same assessment time point at the within person level. And then also we're allowed to co-vary at the between person level. I'm happy to show full results if people are interested in them, but what I'm going to focus on now is just the results with each of those 3 other the 2 support-seeking variables in relation to suicidal ideation, since those were our primary questions of interest. Next slide. So what you can see here is that at the same assessment time point, support-seeking behavior was positively associated with the current levels of suicidal ideation, meaning if a person reported higher levels of suicidal ideation relative to their own mean, they were also more likely to report that they had sought support since the last time point. They were also less likely or more likely to report lower levels of perceived support at that same time that they were reporting suicidal ideation. So essentially, elevated levels of suicidal ideation were associated with support-seeking behavior and lower perceived social support. At the between-person level, these results were somewhat different. We again saw the negative association between mean levels of suicidal ideation and perceived support, meaning individuals who reported greater ideation on average reported lower perceived social support. However, we did not see an association between general levels of support-seeking behavior and overall levels of suicidal ideation. That's why the dashed line where the value of 0.17 indicates that it was not statistically significant. Next slide. So said another way, for those of us like me who find it easier to review these in words rather than in images, so when a person's suicidal ideation is higher than their average, they report lower perceived social support, but they're more likely to report seeking support. Next slide. And people who report SI on average is higher at the between person level report lower perceived social support, but don't differ in their level of support-seeking behavior. Next slide. With respect to implications and limitations, I think there's a lot of really valuable and interesting questions here about how these things potentially relate to each other. So on the one hand, it's possible that people who are experiencing suicidal ideation are then driven to seek help from others. It's also possible that people attempt to seek help for others with emotional support or other aspects of their lives. If that doesn't go well, that could then drive subsequent suicidal ideation. When these data are completely collected, we plan to focus only on the data from signal contingent weeks and to examine lagged analyses to look at ways to control for past survey suicidal ideation to examine changes over time related to perceived and sought social support. Next slide. One important implication that I think is really critical and that our 2 other speakers briefly mentioned is relative to interventions for supporting help seeking. We often tell people, reach out, talk to others, try to seek support, but we don't actually think through whether that's going to be useful depending on whether effective or available help is accessible to that individual. And so this may have implications for trying to intervene at the family level, at the community level, at the social support network level to ensure that when people actually reach out for support, that support is perceived as being helpful, perceived as increasing their support in a way that would then be protective against suicidal ideation. Next slide. Lastly, it's important to know that these are specific to young adults, and again, all of these data were collected post-pandemic, which can certainly change both perceptions of social support and desire to seek support and the ways in which we seek support. This would also need to be examined in different age ranges where we know suicide risk is high, for instance, in adolescents and in older adults whose social networks may look very different from young adults, and in more racial and ethnically diverse samples, where you would have the statistical power to examine whether these effects are robust across racial and ethnic groups, since again, we know that these experiences and social environments are going to vary importantly across different communities. Next slide. So I want to thank the members of my lab, my undergraduate and graduate research assistants, without whom this project would have been impossible, our participants, as well as Texas Tech University for supporting this project. And I'm happy to answer questions. I know we also have some time available for questions to the panel broadly.